All right, let's go ahead and get started, everybody. Welcome back to the Dharma Doors. I'm MC Owens, and this is the San Francisco Dharma Collective. Tonight, we're going to actually start a new sutta. Um, we may read it all tonight, not sure. But what we're going to do is we're actually, if you've been coming to Dharma Doors for a while or lately, we've been spending quite a bit of time, multiple sessions, talking about Sutta number 77, which is the Sakuludāyi Sutta. So the big discourse to Udayin. I'm skipping Sutta number 78, and I'm jumping right to Sutta number 79 in the Majjhima Nikāya, because this one is the shorter discourse to Udayin. So the Cūḷasakuludāyi Sutta. And so I wanted to kind of jump right to the conclusion of Udayin's story because we've been kind of spending so much time with him. I wanted to kind of see where the rest of his story goes. Now, I'm positive that there's important information in Sutta number 78 that we probably need for this. And I'm sure later on when we read Sutta 78, I'll regret not having done it first because I have realized that these are in a particular order. But I did read through Sutta 78 and I didn't notice any particular points of interest that we needed tonight. So we're going to jump to Sutta 79. So that's in the Majjhima Nikāya, Sutta 79, the Cūḷasakuludāyi Sutta, the little teaching to Udayin. Yeah, we're going to dive right in, but there's ideas that pop up right away that we'll have reason to talk about. So let's dive in. And the first thing that we're going to actually notice is that this version or this sutta, it begins exactly like the other version. So, thus have I heard. On one occasion, the Blessed One was living at Rajgaha in the bamboo grove, the squirrel's sanctuary. Now, on that occasion, the wanderer Sakuludāyin was staying in the peacock's sanctuary, the wanderer's park, with a large assembly of parijatikas, or wanderers. Then, when it was morning, the Blessed One dressed, and taking his bowl and outer robe, he went to Rajgaha to beg for alms. Then he thought, just like in the first version of the sutta, it's still too early to wander for alms in Rajgaha. Suppose I went to the wanderer Sakuludāyin in the peacock sanctuary, the wanderer's park. Then the Blessed One went to the peacock sanctuary, the wanderer's park, and on that occasion, the wanderer Sakuludāyin was seated with a large assembly of wanderers who were making an uproar. Now, this, of course, does not repeat what was presented in the Sutta number 78. We don't need to read through that whole section, but it was a long list of idle chatter, a long list of various topics concerning the world that all of the wanderers were sort of not even really debating, just sort of chatting about in an uproar. But then, and I'm summarizing the part that's missing here. But then what happens is that they see the Buddha coming and everybody says, ooh, ooh, quiet down, everybody. The Buddha likes quiet. If we're all quiet, he might come over and hang out with us. And so they all quiet down. And then the Buddha steps up and says, hey, for what discussion are you sitting together here now, Udayin? And what was your discussion that was interrupted, like when I showed up? And the Udayin says, Venerable Sir, let be the discussion for which we are now seated together here. The Blessed One could well hear about that later. Venerable Sir, when I do not come, so this is Udayin talking, and he says, when I do not come to this assembly, then it just sits and talking about many kinds of pointless things, talking many kinds of pointless talk. Udayin says, but when I come to the assembly, then it sits looking up to me, thinking we shall hear the Dharma that the recluse Udayin will expound to us. However, Udayin says, when you, the Blessed One, come, then both I and the assembly sit looking up to the Blessed One, thinking we shall hear the Dharma that the Blessed One will expound to us. And the Buddha says, well then, Udayin, suggest something that I should talk about. And then Udayin says, Venerable Sir, in recent days, there was one claiming to be omniscient and all-seeing, one claiming to have complete knowledge and vision like this. Whether I'm walking or standing or sleeping or awake, knowledge and vision are continuously and uninterruptedly present to me. Udayin says, though, that when I asked this person a question about the past, he prevaricated. He led the talk aside. He showed anger, hate, and bitterness. Ah, then rapture regarding the Blessed One arose in me this way. Ah, surely it is the Blessed One. Surely it is the Sublime One, the Sugata, who is skilled in these things. And the Buddha says, but Udayin, who was it that claimed to be omniscient and all-seeing in the way that you just described, yet when asked a question by you about the past, prevaricated, led the talk aside, and showed anger, hatred, and bitterness? Who was it? It was the Nigantaha Nataputta, Venerable Sir. So we've encountered the Niganta Nataputta before. He's a character that pops up a lot in the suttas. He's the leader of the Nigantahas, or Nataputta is the leader of this group. They are basically the Jains or Jain tradition. That's sort of what they kind of represent in the Pali Suttas. And we've heard about this before, which is that Mahavira, or the Niganta Nataputta, the leader of the Jains, claimed to be omniscient, but he claimed to be omniscient in a certain way, which is sort of knowing everything all the time. But then Udayin is like, yeah, but then I asked him about the past and he just got all mad at me and basically just sort of redirected the conversation. So Udayin says, he says, I was a little disappointed in his omniscience. But then Udayin says, but then I thought of the Blessed One. But then I thought of the Buddha, and he knows about this stuff. I should go ask him. So that's the basics. Udayin wants to know about the superpowers, wants to know about omniscience in that way. And so the Buddha says, this is the Buddha's response. He says, Udayin, if someone should recollect their manifold past lives, that is 1 birth, 2 births, 3 births, 5 births, 100 births, 1,000 births, 100,000 births, and remember them all with all of their particulars, thus, with all their aspects and particulars, if they should recollect their manifold past lives, then either they might ask me a question about the past, or I might ask them a question about the past. And they might be satisfied with my answer to the question, or I might be satisfied, or I might satisfy their mind, or they might satisfy my mind with the answer to my question. And then this is also true of someone with the divine eye. If someone with the divine eye, which is purified, surpasses the human eye, if they should see beings passing away and reappearing, inferior, superior, fair, ugly, fortunate, or unfortunate, and they should understand how beings pass on according to their actions. So if somebody had that divine eye and they could, hold on one second, everybody. I think my battery's about to die, and that would be bad. Excellent. All right. So if somebody else, he says, who has the divine eye, and they're seeing beings passing on into their future rebirths and all of that, the Buddha says, and they understand how beings pass on according to their actions, then I might ask that person a question about the future. Or I might ask them a question, or they might ask me a question about the future. And they might satisfy my mind with their answer to my question, or I might satisfy their mind with my answer to the question. But you know what, Udayin? Let the past be. Let the future be. I shall teach you the Dharma. When this exists, that comes to be. With the arising of this, there's that. When this does not exist, that does not come to be. With the cessation of this, that ceases. Really quickly, in case you didn't catch about the whole recollecting past lives or the divine eye, the way that I understand what the Buddha said is he says, well, when I get into conversations with people about like the past, like past lives stuff, whatever I say, they kind of agree with. And when they say things, I agree with them, meaning like we see the past the same. Same with the future. We are satisfied with each other's reports in that way. And basically, Udayin was not satisfied with the Niganta Nataputta's reply about the past. He was not satisfied because the Niganta Nataputta got all mad, redirected the conversation, and ultimately, in a way, didn't answer. Where the Buddha's saying, but when I talk to people about past life stuff, we agree. It satisfies both of our minds. But then the Buddha says, but forget about the past and the future. Let that stuff be. I'm going to teach you the Dharma. And what the Buddha says is this, it's a stock phrase. We've seen it, we've heard it before. And it's a stock phrase about when there's this, there's that. If there's not this, there's no that. And the thing about that formula, if you haven't heard that formula before, that's the formula that the Buddha uses to explain dependent origination or pratitya samutpata. And that formula which says when this arises or when there is this, or when this exists, that comes to be. You can read that, and I would strongly suggest reading that and understanding that at least two different ways. The standard way to understand what the Buddha's talking about is that when he says this and that, he's referring traditionally to the 12-link chain of dependent origination, and he's saying that when ignorance exists, for example, the first link in the 12-link chain of dependent origination, when this exists, meaning when ignorance exists, conditioning or samskara comes to be. And samskara or conditioning is the second link in the 12-link chain of dependent origination. So each of the links gives rise in a way to the next link in the 12-link chain. And so the Buddha is saying, let me teach you the Dharma about what's going on. Meaning like now, here, not past life stuff, not future life stuff. Udayin, let me teach you the Dharma that's going on right here, right now. When there's this, there's that. If there's no ignorance, conditioning ceases to be. And you could do that with all 12 links. The Buddha actually isn't going to launch into a discourse about the 12-link chain of dependent origination, surprisingly. So I'm not going to either. There's a second way to understand that formula, and it's equally applicable. And what it is it's actually a really helpful way of remembering dependent origination, like remembering what it's all about. What it is you want to notice that at the exact moment you declare this, you automatically are creating that. You never, ever, ever get a this without a that. Put it another way, you never, ever get here without a there. The very declaration of here declares there. They arise dependent upon each other. Here and there, this and that, up and down, left and right, yes and no, all these things actually are resting on each other in that way, in a dependently originated way. Even the very idea of this and therefore that. And what I'm pointing to now is me, not me. This, not this. But you never ever get only one of those. And actually, you can think about how it wouldn't make any sense to talk about this if there wasn't a that to contrast it with. So we want to kind of notice that. But that, again, that's not exactly what this sutta is about. But I just wanted you to know that that, of course, is the language of dependent origination. And I think what's important about it in this sutta is that line where the Buddha is saying, forget about the past right now. Forget about the future. Let me teach you about now. So that's, I think, what the Buddha is kind of setting Udayin up for. So, all right, everybody ready for Udayin's response to the Buddha? Cool. So Udayin hears what the Buddha says about recollecting past lives, knowing future lives, and then he hears this crazy thing about if there's this, there's that. And Udayin says, Venerable Sir, I can't even recall this life, is basically what he says. But he says, Venerable Sir, I can't even recollect with their aspects and particulars all that I've experienced within this present existence. So how could I possibly recollect my many-fold past lives? That is, one birth, two births, three births, five births, so on, with all of their aspects and particulars. And how could I do that like you do? And he says, I can't even know a mud goblin. So how should I, with the divine eye, which is purified and surpasses the human, see beings pass away and reappearing, inferior, superior, fair and ugly, fortunate and unfortunate, And how could I understand how beings pass on according to their actions as the Blessed One does? But, but Venerable Sir, when the Blessed One just told me, but let be the past, Udayin, let be the future. I shall teach you the Dharma. When this exists, that comes to be. With the arising of this, that arises. When this does not exist, that does not come to be. And with the cessation of this, that ceases. That's even more unclear to me. He's like, I really don't know what you're talking about with that one. Perhaps, Venerable Sir, I might satisfy the Blessed One's mind by answering a question about our own teacher's doctrine. And so this is an important little piece of information that we didn't really have when we were doing the long discourse with Udayin. And in many ways, bad teacher on my part. I should have done my homework, but it's in this sutta that we kind of learn and realize, oh, Udayin is a teacher of a different tradition. He's not a Buddhist. He's his own teacher in his own kind of lineage, and he has a teacher himself, and he has students. And so the Buddha, or he says, I don't understand anything you just said about, recollecting past lives, knowing future lives, and this whole business about this and that. He's like, you would have a better luck asking me about my teacher's teaching or about like our doctrine. And so the Buddha says, well, Udayin, what is taught in your own teacher's doctrine or Dharma? So what does your teacher teach? Venerable Sir, Udayin says, it is taught that in our own teacher's doctrine, quote, this is the perfect splendor. This is the perfect splendor. And really quickly, because this is going to be a lot about perfect splendor, a quick little language thing. So this idea of paramo vanyo, is that it? Paramo vanyo. Paramo, ultimate, highest, that, the perfect, I guess, is being translated here. And then the word of this splendor is vanyo. And vanyo is related to the words like varna, a kind of luster, a shine, luminosity is wrapped up in this idea of vanyo, or yeah, in vanyo. I'm pretty sure that the English word varnish comes from this word, but I have yet to nail that one down. So for all the etymology heads out there, let's look into that one. But this idea of the perfect splendor, it's a particular state of being. All right. And it's actually, we're going to find out very soon, it is not absent from the Buddhist tradition. All right. And it actually, basically, just to give you a heads up, it corresponds to the third jhana. All right. So whoever Udayin's teacher is, he apparently teaches that the highest state that you could reach is the third jhana, that they call this perfect splendor. But the Buddha has a great question. He says, okay, but Udayin, since it's taught in your own teacher's doctrine, this is the perfect splendor. This is the perfect splendor. What is that perfect splendor? And Udayin says, Venerable Sir, that splendor is the perfect splendor. which is unsurpassed by any other splendor. It's higher or more sublime than any other splendor. But Udayin, the Buddha says, what is that splendor which is unsurpassed by any other splendor, higher, more sublime than any other splendor? And Udayin says, uh, Venerable Sir, that splendor is the perfect splendor which is unsurpassed by any other splendor, higher and more sublime. And then the Buddha stops him right there and he says, Udayin, you might continue for a long time in this way. Meaning, just repeating yourself in that sense, right? So you say, Venerable Sir, that splendor is the perfect splendor, which is unsurpassed by any other splendor, higher or more sublime. Yet, Udayin, you don't indicate what that splendor is. For example, suppose there were a man and he were to say, I'm in love with the most beautiful girl in the world. And then somebody would ask this guy, good man, the most beautiful girl in the world with whom you are in love, do you know whether she is from a noble class or the Brahmin class or the merchant class or maybe the worker class? And the man would say, I don't know. And then they would ask him further, good man, that most beautiful girl in the world with whom you are in love, do you know her name? Do you know what clan she comes from? No, I don't. Oh, do you know whether she's tall or short or maybe like middle height? And the guy says, I don't know. And they ask again, is she dark colored, brown colored, golden colored skin? I don't know, he says. Oh, what village or town does she live in? Maybe that'll help. And the man again would say, no, I don't know. And then they would ask him, good man, do you then love a girl who you've never even known or seen? And he would have to reply, yes. What do you think, Udayin? That being so, would that man's talk not amount to a bunch of nonsense? Surely, Venerable Sir, that being so, that man's talk would amount to a bunch of nonsense. But in the same way, Udayin, you say this, that splendor is the perfect splendor, which is unsurpassed by any other splendor, higher or more sublime. Yet you don't indicate what that splendor is. And then Udayin says this, and it's important that we know that this is Udayin saying this. So Udayin says, Venerable Sir, just as a beautiful beryl gem of purest water, eight-faceted, well-cut, it's as if it were lying on a red brocade, a red cloth, and that gem that glows, it radiates and shines of such splendor, it glows, it radiates and shines of such splendor is the self surviving unimpaired after death. So we need to talk about that before we can get to the next section, meaning the Buddha's reply. So if you were here last week, or it might have been the week before, I'm not sure, but if you were here for the Udayin Sutta, you'll recognize that we've heard this before. The bit about the beryl gem, and it's a beryl gem that's like water. And that's important because what it means is, I don't know if you know what beryl is, right? But it's kind of like a quartzy crystal. And it comes in a bunch of different colors depending on the impurities in it. But there is a type of beryl that is perfectly clear. I believe that's what they're referring to as that it's a water beryl because it's clear. It's eight faceted, same as before, but in the other sutta with Udayin, it was the Buddha who used this example to describe the eight faceted beryl gem and a thread that was running through it. And the thread might be red, white, yellow, blue, or brown. And the Buddha uses this in a very enigmatic little, like almost like a koan, where it's like if you meditate on this analogy of the beryl gem penetrated by this thread, there's an insight there regarding the impermanence of the body and consciousness. And we talked a little bit about this when we did that, and we had different interpretations of what that might mean. Now we're hearing it again, but this time it's coming from Udayin, not from the Buddha. And it's not that there's a thread running through it, it's that the gem is being placed on a red brocade, a red cloth. And the idea is that the color or the redness of the cloth is causing this crystal-like gem to kind of glow. And Udayin says this wild thing, which is that the gem shines and glows just like the splendor, there's that word, vanyo, just like the splendor of the self-surviving unimpaired after death. And in that, it's a big Pali phrase. If you are really interested, Bhikkhu Bodhi, Bhikkhu Nyanamoli, their footnote number 783 here is very informative. It's a big, long, crazy Pali, sentence. It does include the word atta, the Atman, that idea of the self, the permanent self in that way, that the Buddha is always talking about anatta. Well, this guy, Udayin, and his teacher, they apparently have a belief in this atta, the real self that survives unimpaired after death. All right. So that gives us I think that gives us a clue to how to interpret the beryl gem example from last time, where it does seem that the beryl gem is the mortal temporal body, and that the thread or the brocade here is sort of like the permanent in that way. I know last week or whenever that was, we kind of went back and forth on which is the body and which is consciousness in the Buddha's analogy. I think this is a clue, but again, I think it's still open to interpretation. Now, what is this self that survives unimpaired after death? Well, Bhikkhu Bodhi's little comment on that, I mean, in many ways, I should probably save this for a little bit later, but we kind of want to keep in mind that because of where this is going, we're going to want to keep in mind that in the world of Buddhism, when they describe moving to a jhanic state, and then even further into a jhana, they often describe that process as a process of rebirth and actually kind of ceasing to exist for a little while in the realm of desire and being reborn in the realm of form. And then, by the way, this is all what I'm about to give you is like standard, classic, early Buddhist teaching, by the way. But it's a general understanding that if you can get your mind consciousness into a jhana, and it has to actually be a higher jhana, not just the first jhana. But if you happen to be in one of these higher jhanas, and oh, I don't know, the world were to end, you would survive the destruction of the world because you were in a jhanic state. And then when the world reformed after kalpas and kalpas and kalpas, you could be one of the first to descend from that jhanic state back down into the world, the new world. And it is actually how the world, or how a new world, a newly formed world, it gets populated or repopulated because beings that had made it out of the world and were in jhanic states start getting curious about the realm of desire. And they start dropping out of meditative states and getting wrapped up in the world. And then they start reproducing. And then it just causes the whole world to keep going again. So the interpretation, the traditional understanding of what Udayin means by the self that survives unimpaired after death, he seems to be referring to that state of being that survives the world being destroyed. That's what seems to be the classic interpretation of this line. Take it for what it's worth. But this is what basically Udayin's teaching, it's what he's been taught, and he's teaching, is how to transcend the world, how to get into this highest perfect splendor. And he's teaching that that's the ultimate kind of be all to end all of existence, to make it there. And he uses this glowing beryl gem as an example of that highest splendor. But then this is what the Buddha has to say. He says, well, what do you think, Udayin? This beautiful beryl gem of purest water, eight-faceted, well-cut, lying on a red brocade, which glows, radiates, and shines. So what do you think? This gem or a glowworm in the thick of the darkness of night? Of these two, which gives off the splendor that is more excellent and sublime? Udayin replies, the glowworm in the thick of darkness of the night, Venerable Sir. Okay. What do you think, Udayin? This glowworm in the thick of the darkness of the night, or an oil lamp in the thick darkness of the night, of these two, which gives off the splendor that is more excellent and sublime? The oil lamp, Venerable Sir. All right, what do you think, Udayin? This oil lamp in the thick darkness of the night, or a great bonfire in the thick darkness of the night? Of these two, which gives off the splendor that is more excellent and sublime? The great bonfire, Venerable Sir. Ah, what do you think, Udayin? This great bonfire in the thick darkness of the night, or the morning star towards dawn on a clear cloudless sky. Of these two, which gives off the splendor that is more excellent and sublime? The morning star towards dawn in a clear cloudless sky, Venerable Sir. What do you think, Udayin? The morning star towards dawn in a clear cloudless sky, or the full moon at midnight in a clear cloudless sky on the Upasatta day of the 15th. Of these two, which gives off the splendor that is more excellent and sublime? Oh, the full moon at midnight in a clear, cloudless sky on the Upasata day of the 15th, Venerable Sir. And what do you think, Udayin? The full moon at midnight in a clear, cloudless sky on the Upasapa day of the 15th, or the full disk of the sun at midday in a clear, cloudless sky in autumn in the last month of the rainy season. Of these two, which gives off the splendor that is more excellent and sublime? Oh, the full disk of the sun at midday in a clear, cloudless sky in autumn in the last month of the rainy season, Venerable Sir. Well, Udayin, beyond this, I know of very many gods whose splendor, the radiance of the sun and moon, doesn't even match. Yet, I don't say that there's no splendor higher or more sublime than that splendor. But you, Udayin, say of that splendor which is much lower and meaner than a glowworm's, that this is the perfect splendor, yet you do not indicate what that splendor is. And with that, Udayin says, boom, the Blessed One has terminated the discussion. The Sugata, the well-gone one, the sublime one, has terminated the discussion. And the Buddha says, but Udayin, why do you say that? And Udayin says, Venerable Sir, it's taught in our own teacher's doctrine. This is the perfect splendor. This is the perfect splendor. But on being pressed and questioned and cross-questioned about our own teacher's doctrine by the Blessed One, I'm found to be empty, hollow, and mistaken. So that's the end of the first kind of, I would say the kind of the first part, first question of Udayin. All right. Anything come up for anybody about that? I mean, in many ways, it's still building up to the oomph of the teaching. All right. Yeah. So next question. The Buddha says, how is it, Udayin? Is there an exclusively pleasant world? Is there a practical way to realize an exclusively pleasant world? So we're talking about sukha. So we're talking about bliss, sukha, and a loka. So a sukha loka, an entirely sukha world. And the Buddha wants to know, so according to you, is there such a thing as totally pleasant world? And is there a practical way to realize it? Um, really quickly, because I have a note here on my notes. So before we get to this next section about an entirely or exclusively pleasant world, last week, actually last sutra, if you were coming, that sutta, the big Udayin Sutta, it was about these 5 qualities that make the Buddha venerable. And it wasn't that he just eats a little bit and sleeps wherever, like Udayin thought. No, the Buddha is an aggregation of merit. He's like an upright person in that way. And then the second reason that the Buddha is venerated or venerable is he's knowledgeable. And I was saying last week and the weeks before, it's a very small paragraph that basically says that when the Buddha says he knows something, he knows it. And there were some questions, maybe last week it was, but there were a few questions from you all that it was like, well, what exactly does that mean? Like the knowledge part of it. like, and that he knows what he's talking about. I wanted to stop for a moment because this is actually sort of addressing that idea. And what it is that Udayin doesn't know what he's talking about. And I don't mean that he's stupid, like doesn't know what he's talking about. The Buddha is basically saying, it's like you're saying you're in love with this girl, but you don't know where she lives, what her name is, what she looks like. It's almost as if you're in love with something you've never actually met. And that's what the Buddha's saying. He's like, you're telling me that there's this perfect splendor, but you're not telling me what it is. So Udayin does not have knowledge. In a way, he's been taught a tradition and then is passing on that tradition, but doesn't have direct knowledge of it himself, it would seem. Everything that's about to happen kind of now or very quickly regarding the Buddha is a demonstration of how the Buddha knows what he is teaching in that way. So I just wanted to connect this part that we're about to do with that section from the last sutra that was a little confusing in terms of what does it mean that the Buddha is knowledgeable. So, all right. So this is going to be interesting though. And what's going to be interesting is to notice the overlap between Udayin's tradition, Udayinism or whatever, but just call it whatever it is. We want to notice the overlap between that and our good old Buddha Dharma. So, um, Udayin says, Venerable Sir, it is taught in my teacher, in our own teacher's doctrine, that there is an exclusively pleasant world, and there's a practical way to realize an exclusively pleasant world. But Udayin, what is that practical way to realize an exclusively pleasant world? And Udayin says, well, here, Venerable Sir, abandoning the killing of living beings, someone abstains from killing living beings. Abandoning taking what has not been given, one abstains from taking what has not been given. Abandoning misconduct in sensual pleasures, one abandons misconduct in sensual pleasures. Abandoning false speech, one abstains from false speech. Or one undertakes the practice of some kind of austerity or asceticism. This is the practical way to realize an exclusively pleasant world. But the Buddha has a question about all of that. And he says, but what do you think, Udayin? On the occasion when someone abandons the killing of living beings and abstains from killing living beings, do they feel only pleasure or both pleasure and pain? And Udayin says, both pleasure and pain, Venerable Sir. And just because of where this is going, I kind of want to give everybody a way to think about this. So abstaining from killing, this idea of ahimsa, right? Well, the way that you can understand what the Buddha just asked regarding that, because if you're out there and you're like me, you might wonder, how could it be like both pleasurable and painful to abstain from killing? Like, I'm not into killing, and I'm not really particularly suffering as a result of that. But to give you a way to think about this, what they are kind of talking about is like going hardcore vegan. No more, no more supporting killing. And what they're saying is that's hard. Not everybody is like super thrilled every day to eat tofu or what have you. Like the idea is that it's kind of a austerity to give up eating meat and eating animal products in that way. So I want you to connect with this not in terms of the violence, but in terms of the lifestyle of not having anything to do with killing anymore. And the Buddha is saying, so when somebody agrees to do that, are they just like in pure pleasure all the time? And Udayin says, no, it's both pleasurable and painful to abstain from killing. And then the Buddha does the same with, and what do you think, Udayin? On the occasion when someone abandons the taking of what has not been given and abstains from taking what has not been given, do they feel both or exclusively pleasure or a little bit of both, right? Or when one abandons misconduct and sensual pleasures and abstains from misconduct and sensual pleasures, or when one abandons false speech and abstains from false speech, or when one, uh, or abstains from false speech. Do they feel only pleasure when they do those things, or both pleasure and pain? Both pleasure and pain, Venerable Sir. Oh, and what do you think, Udayin? On the occasion when someone undertakes and practices some kind of asceticism, do they then only feel pleasure or both pleasure and pain? And Udayin says both pleasure and pain. What do you think, Udayin? Does the realization of an exclusively pleasant world come about by falling away of mixed both pleasure and pain? And once again, Udayin says, the Blessed One has terminated the discussion. The Sublime One has terminated the discussion. And the Buddha says, but Udayin, why do you say that? And he says, Venerable Sir, it's taught in our own teacher's doctrine. There is an exclusively pleasant world. There is a practical way to realize an exclusively pleasant world. But on being pressed and questioned and cross-questioned about our own teacher's doctrine by the Blessed One, we are found to be empty, hollow, and mistaken. But, and now he's saying to the Buddha, but Buddha, how is it, Venerable Sir? Is there an exclusively pleasant world? Is there a practical way to the realization of an exclusively pleasant world? And the Buddha says there is an exclusively pleasant world. Udayin, there is a practical way to realize an exclusively pleasant world. So if you're like me, you're on the edge of your cushion, right? You like, what? I want to know this practical way to realize this, right? That's how the sutra should be working on us in that way, that it's built up the hype. Well, it should come as no surprise. Here, Udayin, quite secluded from sensual pleasures, secluded from unwholesome states, a practitioner enters upon and abides in the first jhana. And then with the stilling of applied and sustained thought, they enter upon and abide in the second jhana. And then going further, I'm not going to do the whole jhana talk, but then they get into the third jhana. And the Buddha then says, this is the practical way to realize an exclusively pleasant world. And Udayin stops him right there and says, no, Venerable Sir, that's not the practical way to realize an exclusively pleasant world. No, 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 no. At that point, an exclusively pleasant world has been realized. So this is where we get confirmation that for Udayin, the third jhana is it. That's the perfect splendor. That's a totally exclusively pleasant world. The Buddhas said, no, 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 that's how you get to an exclusively pleasant world, right? So once again, the Udayin says, yeah, that's not the practical way. That's it. And then Udayin, the Buddha says, no, at that point, an exclusively pleasant world has not yet been realized. That is only the practical way to realize an exclusively pleasant world. And when this was said, the wanderer Sakuludāyi's assembly made an uproar, saying very loudly and noisily, "We're lost along with our own teacher's doctrines. We're lost along with our own teacher's doctrines. We know nothing higher than the third jhana." Then the wanderer Sakuludāyi quieted down all those wanderers and asked the Blessed One, "Venerable Sir, at what point is an exclusively pleasant world realized?" Or, yeah, world realized. And then the Buddha says, "Here, Udayin, with the abandoning of pleasure and pain, and with the previous disappearance of joy and grief, a bhikkhu, a practitioner, enters upon and abides in the fourth jhana, which has neither pleasure nor pain, and a purity of mindfulness due to equanimity. One dwells with those deities who have arisen in an entirely pleasant world and talks with them and enters into conversation with them. It's at this point that an exclusively pleasant world has been realized." So, and then Udayin's going to ask this question, which is, "Buddha, Venerable Sir, surely that's why people follow you. So surely it is for the sake of realizing that exclusively pleasant world that bhikkhus lead the holy life under the Blessed One." Now, that's not why they follow the Blessed One. But really quickly, I want to just talk about the third, fourth jhana distinction there. So we've encountered this sort of idea before in many suttas, and it's this idea of pleasure in that way. And, pleasure in the world of Buddhism, there's a lot of different degrees of pleasure, moving from Nanda ideas of pleasure to, sukha and piti and all of these ideas. So there's a whole kind of family of ideas of joy, pleasure, rapture, bliss, all of these things. And one of the things that we'll want to remember, and I probably should dig around and try to find the exact language, but I won't. But you've heard it a million times. If you've been coming to Dharma doors, you've heard it a million times. It's the thing that they say about the third jhana. And it's the third jhana that it's in that state that the noble ones say one has a pleasant abiding. You might remember that's always when you get into the third jhana, they're always yeah, this is the spot. This is the one where the noble ones say this is a good abiding. And it would seem, both from the life story of the Buddha and from information in the suttas, it would seem that there was a very strong meditative tradition in India at the time of the Buddha that was basically saying the third jhana is it. And even Buddhism recognizes that, oh yeah, that's what everybody says. The third jhana is where that's a really peaceful abiding. But what makes Buddhism Buddhism in that way is the fourth jhana and beyond. And in particular, what we want to notice is that it's in the fourth jhana that one transcends pleasure and pain. And that's what puts that fourth jhana in a very different category than the third jhana, where you have, like, in terms of the spectrum of pleasure and pain, you've moved the barometer all the way to the pleasure side of things in the third jhana. And the thing about it is that there's like how could I put this simply, right? There's a game being played, and the game is called maximize pleasure. And that's happening at a worldly level where we are always trying to maximize pleasure and minimize pain in that way. And then it even happens at a spiritual level where we want to have exclusively pleasure, no pain in that way. So whether, again, whether it's like trying to make a lot of money to maximize pleasure, whether it is taking a lot of medication to maximize pleasure, whether it's whatever it is, meditating a lot to maximize pleasure. What makes Buddhism Buddhism is that it doesn't play that game. It's not interested in playing the maximize pleasure game. So even though the Buddha is saying, oh, yeah, the fourth jhana, that's exclusively pleasant, because it is. But it's not why we're doing this. That's the key right there. Is the Buddha saying, oh, yeah, it's pleasurable, but that's not why we're doing this. And at that point, someone like Udayin, who's trying to maximize pleasure, just because he's kind of noble in that he's observing precepts, not killing, not stealing, not lying, and doing all of that. The point is, though, is that he's just as guilty of pursuing pleasure. And that's where the Buddha is saying, yeah, like, so when he asked that question, or when Udayin says, oh, so this must be why people leave, give up their house, give up their stuff, give up their hair. This must be why they follow you, to achieve that fourth jhana that's entirely pleasant. And the Buddha says, no, it is not for the sake of realizing that exclusively pleasant world that bhikkhus lead the holy life under me. There are other states, Udayin, higher and more sublime than that. And it's for the sake of realizing them that bhikkhus lead the holy life under me. Ooh, what are those higher and more sublime states, Venerable Sir? For the sake of realizing which bhikkhus lead the holy life under the Blessed One. And then we get the big, long, stock, many paragraphs. So if you go all the way back to Sutta number 51 in this, they have the entire thing. It begins with that a Tathagata appears in the world, accomplished, fully enlightened, and then someone, a householder, decides to leave the house life, go into homelessness. They follow all the precepts, they do all the preliminary work, and then, so I just paraphrased a giant amount of information, but that's a stock phrase, or again, many paragraphs that appear in many, many, many suttas where the Buddha describes the basic path. And the path culminates with the abandoning of the 5 hindrances, right? So let's remember these 5 hindrances. The word hindrance, this nivaranya, we want to remember that that word means a covering, actually. Even though it's translated as a hindrance, it's actually like if you were to put a wet towel over your head. But there are these 5 coverings of the mind: sensual pleasure, anger, anxiety or restlessness and worry, doubt, and like sloth and torpor, right? Laziness, basically, right? So doubt, being lazy, being angry, being overly desirous, and being anxious. Those are like coverings of the mind. If you were to sort of successfully, and there are the techniques for doing this, but if you were to successfully let go of your anxiety, if you were to successfully let go of your anger, let go of your doubt, let go of your laziness, right? Let go of your wanting, craving, desiriness. So, having thus abandoned these five hindrances, imperfections of the mind that weaken wisdom, then, quite secluded from sensual pleasures, secluded from unwholesome states, a bhikkhu enters upon and abides in the first jhana. And that, Udayin, is a higher and more sublime state for the sake of realizing which bhikkhus lead the holy life under me. And then again, with the stilling of vitarka and vichaya, with the stilling of applied and sustained thought, a bhikkhu enters upon and abides in the second jhana, then the third jhana, and then the fourth jhana. And all of those too, Udayin, are higher and more sublime states for the sake of realizing which bhikkhus lead the holy life under the Buddha. And then the practitioner, with their mind concentrated and thus purified and bright, the mind unblemished, rid of imperfection, malleable, wieldy, steady, and attained to imperturbability, the practitioner directs their mind to knowledge of the recollection of past lives, and they recollect their manifold past lives. That is one birth, two births, many, many births, with all of their particulars. Thus, with their aspects and particulars, one recollects their manifold past lives, and this too, Udayin, is a higher and more sublime state for the sake of which bhikkhus lead the holy life under me. And then, when that practitioner's mind is concentrated, it is thus purified, bright, unblemished, rid of imperfection, malleable, wieldy, steady, and attained to imperturbability. Then the practitioner directs their mind to knowledge of the passing away and reappearance of beings, and this goes through all of the developments of the siddhis, those superpowers. Thus, with the divine eye, which is purified and surpasses the human, they see beings passing away and reappearing, inferior and superior, fair and ugly, fortunate and unfortunate. And such a practitioner as this understands how beings pass on according to their karmic activities. This too, Udayin, is a higher and more sublime state for the sake of which bhikkhus lead the holy life under me. And then finally, when their concentrated mind is thus purified, bright, unblemished, rid of imperfection, malleable, wieldy, steady, and attained to imperturbability, they direct it to knowledge of the destruction of the taints. And they understand as it actually is, this is suffering. This is the cause of suffering. This is the cessation of suffering. This is the path leading to the cessation of suffering. They understand as it actually is, this is the path leading to the cessation of the taints. When the practitioner knows and sees thus, the mind is liberated from the taint of sensual desire, kama, liberated from the taint of bhava, being, and liberated from the taint of avidya, ignorance. And when that mind is liberated, when it is liberated, there comes the knowledge it's liberated. One understands birth is destroyed. The holy life has been lived. What had to be done has been done. There's no more coming into any state of being. This too, Udayin, is a higher and more sublime state for the sake of realizing which bhikkhus lead the holy life under me. And these, all of these, Udayin, are those higher and more sublime states for the sake of realizing which bhikkhus lead the holy life under me. All right. So there's a couple of things I'd like to discuss, but just because we're so close to the end, we have just enough time. This sutta has a wild ending. It has a wild kind of almost cliffhanger ending, and I don't want to, leave it maybe, for next week. So let's deal with the ending first, then we'll go back and discuss a few things. But so that's how the Buddha concludes it, that these are the higher states that I'm talking about. And when this was said, the wanderer Sakuludāyi said to the Blessed One, "Magnificent, venerable sir, magnificent, venerable sir. The Blessed One has made the Dharma clear in many ways, as though he were turning upright what had been turned upside down, revealing what had been hidden, showing the way to one who was lost, or holding up a lamp in the dark for those with eyesight to see forms. I go to the Blessed One for refuge, and to the Dharma, and to the Sangha of bhikkhus. I would receive the going forth under the Blessed One, venerable sir. I would like to receive the full ordination." And when this was said, the wanderer Sakuludāyi's assembly addressed him this way: "Don't do that. Don't lead the holy life under the recluse Gotama, Master Udayin. Having been a teacher already, Master Udayin, do not live as a pupil. For Master Udayin to do so would be as if a water jug were to become a pitcher. Do not lead the holy life under the recluse Gotama, Master Udayin. Having been a teacher, Master Udayin, don't live as a pupil." And that's how the wanderer Sakuludāyi's assembly obstructed him from leading the holy life under the Blessed One. All right, so we did the little Udayin Sutta. Kind of a radical ending there, right? Because that was we've heard that before. The magnificent, magnificent. It's as if somebody's turning upright what had been turned over. Very a stock phrase that we hear whenever somebody has basically been converted. They say that same thing. But then this funny reversal happens where all of his followers convince him to not do it with this interesting idea, right? That no, you're a teacher. You can't become a student again. Big lesson there in that way, in terms of humility, a lot of things. So very interesting kind of conclusion to the sutta. Pretty straightforward, I think, in terms of its message. Yeah. Kind of a classic Buddhist discourse about pleasure and kind of doing meditation for pleasure's sake. Maybe even doing meditation as a form of kind of escapism to just get away from it all, right? And the Buddha basically saying, yeah, that's not why we're doing this in that way. So any questions about that ender? The taints? Yep, I would just I would just kind of want to mention a couple of just interesting points. For me, an interesting thing, this is just sort of like a little aside. It's not really related to the sutta exactly, but I'm always very interested in that. It's also a stock phrase. It's the stock phrase about having a concentrated mind that's purified, bright, unblemished, rid of imperfection, malleable, wieldy, steady, and then attained to imperturbability. Like that whole description of the liberated mind, I think is like really worth like kind of studying almost in a way and really thinking about. And it, because those qualities like being malleable, being wieldy, being steady, like those are all different in that way. So like a steady mind, for example, a meditative mind that can really lock its focus in wherever it would like and can just stay focused on whatever it would like for however long it would like, versus a mind that's easily distracted, right? So a mind that's easily distracted is not steady in that way. Malleable. I think a lot about having a malleable mind. For me, what that means when I've looked into what that means in the suttas, for me, it seems to mean like a non-malleable mind. A non-malleable mind seems to be one where, we would call them intrusive thoughts. And it's like the inability to stop thinking about things. A malleable mind is you can move it however you would like to move it, and you're not subject to whatever is coming up in that way. That could also be a quality of wieldiness too, where you can wield your mind. And it's really helpful actually to pay attention to and think about like the very subtle difference between like just being subjected to thoughts versus having a thought. And so this mind that is wieldy and steady and malleable and all of that is it's a mind that is controlled. And the classic example that we hear all the time, I use the example all the time, but it's the chariot, right, with the five horses, and that for many of us, the horses are just going wherever they would like, meaning the senses are just, ooh, what's that? Ooh, what's that? What'd you say? Smells good. Can I have some? Ooh. So the horses are just running wild. Or there's the horses have been tamed and we can go, come on, we're going over there now. And all the senses are over there now. So that is a wieldy mind, malleable, in control, versus totally out of control mind. And then one of my favorite qualities, akshobhya, imperturbability. I actually like to kind of always remind everybody that akshobhya is a Buddha. Like in the Mahayana Buddhist tradition, the quality of imperturbability, like the actual quality of that is a Buddha unto itself. The blue-bodied Akshobhya Buddha, the imperturbable Buddha. And of course, being perturbed, I think, modern language, we would say being triggered, right? So being perturbed versus being imperturbed, not triggered, not, you can't be got to in that way. So those are qualities of this mind. And I kind of want to just use this last couple minutes to remind you, if you were to read the long multiple paragraph section that I left out, that begins, a Tathagata appears in the world, and then somebody decides to leave their household life and follow them. I kind of would want to remind you that, there's preparatory practices, mainly regarding morality, that then put you in a position to do the meditation, sati, right? Mindfulness. And that is what gets you into a jhana, cultivating jhanic states is what creates this imperturbable, wieldy, malleable mind. And then, as it says, the practitioner can now direct that mind wherever they would like it to go, and they can direct it towards knowledge of past lives. They can direct it towards knowledge of future lives. They can direct it towards all of these super normal, supernatural abilities in that way. And then from all of that, you can then destroy the taints. And that's then an arhat. The burden has been put down, the work has been done, what you had to do has been done. But I want you to kind of always keep in mind that it's a process. And you really, really don't get to just jump to destruction of the taints through like a good weekend of meditation in that way. It's a real kind of a lifetime practice of what we call bhavana, the cultivation, and then culmination. So, all right, that's all I have for tonight. Another sutta. Oh, yes, please, Noe. Any questions or comments or ideas?
Thank you, Michael. Yeah, that number 43 in there, you know, uh, they direct it to knowledge of the destruction of the taint. One understands as it actually is, this is suffering. This is the origins of suffering. This is the release of suffering. This is the path, the Eightfold Path leading to the cessation of suffering. It's so wonderful, yet so lofty here. And I re so I so so here is exactly where it happens.
That's the idea.
That's the idea. So I don't have to, someday, you know,
That's,
practice is practice is practice is practice is practice, just being present and reminding to be present. Reminding, reminding is like, yeah, understanding, oh, I'm distracted. Oh, let's watch that. Oh, let's eat that. Let's do that, as a layman.
mhm.
And yet there it is. It's still all there for. It's still available. Boom, there it is. As long as if there's a direction towards that. That's
Yep.
all I wanted to say. Thank you.
Lovely comment, Noe. Yeah, Robin. Oh, Noe's got you. Mhm.
Okay. Hey, I was wondering, when the Buddha is thinking like, it's like, that's not why we're doing this. It's not for pleasure. Then would you say, so we're doing it, so why are we doing it? I mean, because, that's just so, is it an encapsulated way to say that, I guess?
It, it's a it's a great question. And the answer to that question has been on the tip of my tongue almost all night. I I danced around it, so I'm gonna make a good attempt at answering that. What are we trying to do then? Or in that sense, right? Well, so if you go back a few minutes, whenever it was, and I was talking about that thing about seeking pleasure. And whether you're seeking pleasure this way or in that way, in the realm of desire, or even if you're seeking pleasure in a meditative state. From a Buddhist point of view, like that kind of seeking pleasure is always problematic. Well, I would then, in order to kind of attempt to answer Robin's question, take away the pleasure part of it and just look at the seeking part of it. And you could substitute seeking for wanting, craving, needing. And so the idea here is that Robin's question is, what are we trying to do? Not want, not crave, not seek. And the reason why I was wanting to say this is in response to Noe's great comment, which is the reason why enlightenment or nirvana or whatever you want to call it, the reason why it is right here for the taking. In that, I guess that's a bad way to put it, but nirvana is right here for the having, because at this very moment you could stop craving, wanting, and seeking. So in many ways, Robin, we're actually not trying to do anything. And the problem is all of our wanting and doing all the time. Thinking, oh, pleasure is right around this corner. Total satisfaction is right around this corner. And Buddhism is like, stop seeking. And then you'll have this eternal pleasure in that way. Yeah? Oh, good. It's a subtle answer in that way because it can sound glib, to be like, what are we trying to do? Nothing. Right? I don't want to sound glib in that sense, but I think I got the message across. So, oh, good. Excellent. Excellent. All right, everybody. With such a great question, good answer, let's call it a night.
Thank you, Michael. And it's the regular group here, so
Yeah.
we'll put this online in a day or two when Noam gets back. And thank you, Michael, and thank you all for letting me be your host this evening.
Thank you, Noe. Thanks, everybody, for being here, and see you next week for another sutta. Bye.